The night was black and windless on the frozen fields of Belgium, the 27th of December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had burned through forests and villages like a fever, leaving behind twisted metal, shattered helmets, and men who no longer remembered warmth. A thin moon hovered over the Ardennes, its light glinting off frozen blood and the dull steel of abandoned rifles. In the shallow trench outside a ruined farmhouse near Bastogne, a young British corporal named Arthur Webb pressed his body closer to the earth, listening to the brittle crunch of frost under distant boots. Somewhere out there, prisoners were being marched through the dark, and among them was a German soldier, barely more than a boy, whose trembling hands clutched at nothing but the cold. Webb's breath came in faint white clouds as he adjusted the frayed wool blanket wrapped around his shoulders. It was the only thing standing between him and the brutal wind that swept across the Ardennes like a blade. The snow creaked, under movement, not enemy fire, not shelling, but the slow, dragging rhythm of a column of prisoners being escorted by Allied soldiers. Webb rose slightly from his position, his rifle resting on the trench edge. He saw them then. A line of captured Wehrmacht soldiers stumbling through the snow, their uniforms soaked, their eyes hollow. Most had lost their gloves. One man in particular caught his gaze, a German private, blonde hair frozen into brittle strands, his lips blue, his arms shaking violently. The man's jacket was torn, his breath shallow. Each step looked like it might be his last. The escort stopped near the farmhouse ruins. The prisoners were ordered to rest beside a wall riddled with bullet holes. Webb, still watching, saw the German private collapse into the snow, motionless except for faint trembling. The sergeant in charge gave quick orders for the men to keep watch until morning. They had no tents, no fires, fuel was precious, and smoke meant death. The British soldiers huddled close in small groups, silent under the hard stars. Webb looked at his blanket again, the coarse, army-issued wool that had carried him through Dunkirk, Tobruk, and now the bitter forests of Belgium. He thought of the long night ahead, of frostbite and the whispering wind, and of the man lying a few feet away, whose enemy insignia did not make his suffering any less human. The temperature dropped below -10. The air stung the skin like needles. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled faintly, the sound of a war still raging just beyond the horizon. Webb's mind drifted to his mother's letters from Surrey, the ones that smelled faintly of lavender. "Keep warm, my boy," she'd written. "The cold is cruel." He imagined her face, then looked again at the German prisoner, now shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering in the darkness. Something in Webb's chest tightened. The war had taken his friends, his home, his youth, but it hadn't yet taken his sense of mercy. He crawled across the snow, slow and deliberate, careful not to draw attention. The crunch of frost beneath his knees sounded deafening in the silence. The German turned his head weakly, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Webb stopped beside him and hesitated. For a brief second, the two men stared at each other, soldier and prisoner, enemies divided by language but united by cold. Webb said nothing. Instead, he pulled the blanket from his shoulders, the last barrier between himself and the night, and gently laid it over the German's trembling body. The man blinked in disbelief, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Webb simply nodded once, then leaned against the wall beside him, sharing the edge of the blanket. The German shifted closer, seeking warmth without understanding why his captor had chosen to share it. The hours passed slowly. Webb's fingers turned numb, and his face burned with frostbite. He could hear the faint hum of trucks in the distance, the movement of supply convoys pushing toward the front. The British line held firm, but morale was brittle. Men spoke in whispers of the surprise German offensive, of tiger tanks and ambushed convoys. Yet in that ruined farmhouse, beneath the indifferent stars, the front line blurred into something unrecognizable. There were no sides, no victories, only two human beings fighting the same merciless winter. By dawn, frost clung to their eyelashes. The faint glow of morning filtered through the broken window frames, painting the snow in shades of pale gold and ash. A medic moved among the prisoners, checking pulses, noting who had survived the night. When he reached the German private, he paused, surprised to find warmth still in the man's body. "He's alive," the medic murmured, glancing at Webb. The corporal gave a faint nod, his lips cracked and white. He tried to stand but stumbled, his legs stiff from the cold. "You'll kill yourself doing that, Arthur," the sergeant muttered, pulling him upright. Webb said nothing, his voice frozen like the world around him. Later that day, as the prisoners were loaded onto trucks bound for a temporary camp, the German private caught Webb's eye again. This time, the young man raised his hand in a weak salute, not the rigid, mechanical gesture of Nazi discipline, but a quiet acknowledgement of life owed. Webb returned it briefly, then turned away as the engines roared and the trucks rolled out. Around him, soldiers spoke of upcoming offensives, of ammunition shortages, of how long the snow might last. None mentioned the blanket. As night fell again, Webb sat beside a dying campfire, the orange light flickering across his tired face. He no longer had a blanket, but something within him burned warmer than any wool could provide. He thought about the German's face, the silent gratitude, and wondered what his mother would say if she knew. Perhaps she'd say what she always did, that kindness, even in war, was a soldier's greatest weapon. He looked toward the horizon, where the smoke of battle curled into the sky, and felt the strange peace that comes only after compassion defies hatred. In that frozen corner of Europe, amid the thunder of artillery and the whine of distant aircraft, a small act of humanity had taken root, unnoticed by the generals and unseen by the cameras, but no less real than any victory. It would not change the course of the war, nor make headlines in London or Berlin. Yet for one soldier and one prisoner, it had already redrawn the boundaries of what it meant to fight, to survive, and to remain human in a world that had forgotten how. What neither of them could know was that in the months ahead, as the war edged toward its brutal end, that single act, a shared blanket on a frozen night, would ripple far beyond the battlefield. The German private would carry the memory into captivity, and years later, it would find its way into a letter that crossed the English Channel, addressed to the man who had saved him without a word. But that moment, and what it revealed about mercy amid madness, would come later in the quiet reckoning after the guns fell silent. In the spring of 1945, the snows melted into mud, and the thunder of the Ardennes faded into memory. The Allied lines surged eastward, crossing rivers and burning through what remained of the Third Reich. Yet amid the chaos of collapsing fronts and advancing armor, the story of one shared blanket began to whisper its way through the ranks, a quiet legend passed from trench to trench, carried not by radio but by men who had witnessed something that defied the logic of war. Arthur Webb never mentioned it officially. To him, it had been a simple act, unworthy of report or recognition. But for the German prisoner who survived that night, it became the dividing line between death and the fragile mercy of survival. At a Red Cross camp near Liège, the German soldier, later identified as Franz Müller, age 22, recovered slowly under medical supervision. His lungs, damaged by frostbite, strained with every breath, but he lived. He spoke little to the medics, his English broken. Yet when they found the wool fibers still clinging to his uniform, he tried to explain in gestures the warmth, the blanket, the British soldier. The nurse who took down his statement noted one line: "Enemy gave me life when winter took all." It was never printed in any report, but it lingered like smoke after a shell burst. For Webb, the war ground on. He rejoined his unit in the push toward the Rhine, part of Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The air was filled with the rumble of Shermans, the distant shriek of Typhoon fighters, strafing convoys, and the bitter smell of diesel and gunpowder. Webb's battalion crossed at Wesel in March 1945, one of thousands of men advancing through a landscape flattened by years of bombardment. Engineers from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Corps built pontoon bridges under fire, welding by the light of tracer rounds. Tank crews spoke of the new German anti-tank rockets, the Panzerfaust, and the eerie silence of towns where civilians hid behind boarded windows. Webb felt the war changing tempo, speeding toward an end none could quite imagine. In one ruined village along the Rhine, Webb watched as British and American convoys merged, their radios alive with chatter. Portable sets, many built by engineers from Marconi and Pi, buzzed with coded transmissions. Commanders spoke of encirclement and surrender, of collapsing morale within the Wehrmacht. But at night, when the orders ceased and only the static remained, Webb thought again of that winter night, of the moment when the lines between victory and decency had blurred. He wondered if Müller was still alive somewhere beyond the river, or if war had swallowed him once more. Meanwhile, in the shattered cities of Germany, the human cost became undeniable. Factories that had once built Messerschmitts and Panzer engines now lay silent, their walls cracked by Allied bombs. Civilians scoured ruins for food. Displaced persons filled camps across Europe. Yet stories of mercy, rare, fragile, improbable, began surfacing among the rubble. A Soviet sergeant who shared bread with a captured medic, an American pilot who refused to strafe a fleeing truck of wounded men. Each story carried the same quiet defiance against a world built on hate. They were acts of rebellion, not against orders, but against the brutal arithmetic of total war. When Germany finally surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, Arthur Webb stood among cheering crowds in Hamburg, his uniform stained and torn, his hands trembling not from cold but from disbelief. Fireworks burst in the night sky, painting the ruins in ghostly colors. Some soldiers sang, others drank, but Webb felt only silence. He thought of the faces he had seen, comrades and enemies alike, and the strange truth that survival often had less to do with courage than with chance. The blanket had long since been replaced by standard issue, but the memory clung tighter than any fabric. Months later, as prisoners were repatriated, a letter arrived at a British field post near Hanover. It bore a Red Cross seal and handwriting that was neat but trembling. Inside, written in careful English, were the words of Franz Müller. He described the night near Bastogne, the cold, the fear, the moment when an enemy had knelt beside him and shared his only blanket. He wrote, "I did not know your name, but I knew your heart was not at war." Webb read the letter in silence, then folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. He never told his sergeant or his mates. Some memories belonged only to the men who had lived them. Back in Britain, demobilization began. Soldiers returned to factories, to farms, to families who no longer recognized their faces. The war that had consumed 6 years of their lives was over, but its ghosts remained. Webb took work repairing telephone lines across the countryside, climbing poles, and listening to the hum of the new world rebuilding itself. At night, he sometimes dreamed of the Ardennes, the snow, the silence, the German's pale face in the half-light. He wondered if mercy was remembered, or if it vanished like footprints in melting snow. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Germany was a nation divided and disillusioned. Reconstruction teams moved through cities like Cologne and Dresden, cataloging damage, restoring utilities, burying the dead. Among those assigned to post-war documentation was Franz Müller, released from captivity in 1947. He worked under the guidance of Allied civil engineers, recording reconstruction progress. On his desk, he kept a single relic, a fragment of coarse olive wool from that night. When colleagues asked, he simply said it was the proof that not all enemies were enemies. The British War Office never documented the incident. No medals, no commendations, no mention in after-action reports. Yet decades later, when historians combed through personal letters for a BBC oral history project, they found Webb's copy of Müller's letter tucked inside an envelope, marked Bastogne. The ink had faded, but the story had not. Scholars debated its details, its authenticity, its symbolism. Some dismissed it as a romantic myth of wartime compassion. Others, including veterans who had seen too much to doubt it, called it the purest truth of all. What made it real was not the document itself, but the chain of lives it touched. Webb's children would later donate the letter to the Imperial War Museum, where it rests quietly behind glass. School children stopped to read it, their reflections caught in the glass alongside the faded handwriting. They see two names, Arthur Webb and Franz Müller, and perhaps they imagine that frozen night, the sound of wind moving over the snow, and the silent exchange that defied orders and hatred alike. As Europe healed, so too did its memory of war. Veterans on both sides met at reunions, shook hands, and shared stories that blurred the line between victors and vanquished. The tale of Webb and Müller became part of that quiet canon, not of strategies or weapons, but of the human spirit that persisted beneath it all. For historians, it became a case study in what they called micro-morality, the smallest acts that hold the greatest moral weight. Still, the question lingered: why risk one's life, one's warmth, for an enemy? Perhaps Webb himself never knew. Perhaps it was instinct, or faith, or something older than either, a defiance of the machine that war had made of men. The answer, as with so much of that winter, remained buried in the snow. Yet in that uncertainty lay the story's power, because while empires fell and ideologies shattered, one soldier's choice remained immune to time. It was proof that even in an age defined by cruelty, a single act of mercy could survive the ruins, whispering across generations and leading to a revelation that the world, still scarred and divided, would only begin to understand years later. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself from ash and silence. In London, ration books faded from use, streets buzzed again with laughter and factory whistles, and war receded into the corners of memory. But for Arthur Webb, it never truly ended. He kept the old uniform folded neatly in a drawer, the letter from Franz Müller locked away beside it. Every so often, on cold December nights, he would unfold it, trace the trembling handwriting with his finger, and remember the snow, the fear, and the warmth that defied it all. By 1960, Webb was 50, working as a lineman for the General Post Office, climbing poles in the damp English countryside. He had a wife, 2 children, and a quiet life that no one would have called remarkable. Yet within him, the war still whispered, not in nightmares of shellfire, but in the strange peace of that winter night when mercy had overridden madness. Once, his son found the letter and asked, "Was he really your enemy?" Webb had smiled faintly. "He was," he said, "and he wasn't." In Germany, Müller became an engineer in Cologne's Reconstruction Bureau. His expertise in structural design helped rebuild bridges bombed out during the war. He rarely spoke of combat or captivity, but when he gave lectures to apprentices, he sometimes mentioned a British soldier who remembered his humanity. They thought it was a metaphor, a parable told by a man who had seen too much. But to Müller, it was the most concrete truth he knew. In 1975, 3 decades after the war, a British Veterans Association organized a reunion in Brussels, a symbolic meeting of former enemies who had once fought in the Ardennes. Webb hesitated before attending. He had grown old, his hair thin, his hands rough from years of work. Yet something inside him urged him to go, as if the circle of that frozen night had never quite closed. The hall was warm and filled with voices in English, French, and German. Flags hung from the rafters. Medals gleamed under chandeliers. Webb stood near the back, uneasy amid the chatter. Then he heard his name. A translator called out softly, "Herr Müller, Franz Müller, is looking for a Corporal Arthur Webb from the British Army." Webb turned. Across the crowd, a man in his early 50s approached slowly, leaning on a cane. His eyes, still sharp and blue, widened with recognition. Müller stopped before him, and without a word, extended his hand. The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment, 2 faces, aged by time but linked by a memory untouched by it. Webb grasped his hand firmly. Neither spoke of politics or sides. There were no speeches, no journalists, just 2 men who had shared a single blanket on a night the world had gone insane. They sat together for hours, speaking through halting words and laughter that needed no translation. Müller told Webb he had kept the wool fragment all these years, framed on his desk. Webb admitted he had never forgotten the letter. When the event ended, photographers captured the moment: the handshake, the faint smiles, the quiet dignity. The photo later appeared in a small column of a London newspaper under the headline, "Former Enemies Reunite in Peace." It was read by few, but it meant everything to those who understood that history's real victories were not always fought with guns. In the decades that followed, their story became something larger than either of them. Teachers told it to children, learning about the war, not as propaganda, but as proof that compassion survives, even in catastrophe. Museums displayed their letters, and veterans groups cited their meeting as an example of moral courage. The Imperial War Museum eventually mounted a small exhibit titled "Mercy in the Ardennes," showcasing personal acts of kindness between opposing soldiers, Webb's blanket among them. Visitors would pause before the glass case, where a single faded piece of olive wool rested beside a photograph of two elderly men shaking hands. Historians called such gestures anomalies, but psychologists studying post-war trauma saw them differently. They argued that empathy, even in conflict, was a form of survival, a way the human mind protected itself from collapsing into cruelty. Military analysts drew lessons from it too. They saw how morale, not merely machinery, shaped endurance. The armies that remembered their humanity fought harder, recovered faster, and rebuilt sooner. Mercy, they concluded, was not weakness, it was strategy of the soul. As the Cold War deepened, soldiers in Korea and later Vietnam carried different weapons but the same questions. Could decency survive orders? Could compassion exist in total war? The story of the blanket became a quiet answer passed between generations, a reminder that wars may end, but the choice to remain human never does. Arthur Webb died in 1983, peacefully in his sleep. His wife found the letter still in its envelope, folded beside a worn photograph from the reunion. It was donated, at her request, to the Imperial War Museum, where it remains. Franz Müller passed away 2 years later, his final note to his children reading, "Remember that kindness once saved your father's life." Pass it forward. Today, historians trace their story not through grand strategy, but through memory. Their names appear in documentaries, their letters in archives, their faces in textbooks beside the steel machines of war. They stand as a small, steady flame amid the vast darkness of the 20th century, proof that decency can outlast destruction. In the grand tally of World War II, tens of millions dead, continents scarred, empires broken, a single shared blanket seems insignificant. Yet history is not only built from treaties and gunfire, it is also woven from choices made in silence. Webb's gesture did not end the war, but it reminded the world that victory without virtue is hollow. When visitors pass the glass case in London today, they often linger. Some see only the relic of a forgotten winter. Others see something larger, the moment when one soldier, armed only with compassion, refused to let hatred dictate his humanity. The museum lights reflect off the glass, and beyond it, the old wool catches the glow like the last ember of a dying fire. The plaque below it reads simply, "Shared between enemies, Bastogne, 1944. No rank, no medals, no names of divisions, just a fragment of warmth, preserved against the cold winds of history." And so the story endures, carried by generations who never knew the men themselves. It speaks softly through the decades that courage is not only measured by the will to fight, but by the strength to show mercy. In every war, amid the roar of artillery and the scream of aircraft, there are still those who choose compassion over cruelty, and in doing so, redefine what it means to be victorious. For when the guns fall silent and the maps are redrawn, what remains are not the boundaries men fought over, but the acts that proved, even in the darkest hour, humanity still belonged to those who refused to surrender it.